Hi everyone, this is Professor Mahan. This video is for my Math 130 and Math 140 class. I'm so glad to have you guys here. Today we're going to continue on with the topic of factoring. So we had discussed factoring on Monday and most of you guys showed up, which is great, but I know there were a few of you guys that couldn't. So hopefully you guys got caught up on the material. Real quick, here it is. This is a summary of what factoring is about. So on Monday, we went over how to find the GCF, the greatest common factor. And the greatest common factor, one of the things we always need to keep in mind is that we want to make sure that we factor it to death, meaning we factor it completely all the way. So just because you factored it once after finding the GCF doesn't mean that it's done, so you got to keep going. Okay, and then after we learned how to find a GCF, then we learned how to group. So whenever you have 4 terms, you want to make sure that you group it in order to factor it. And then we also learned if you had 3 terms, then you do the Xbox method, or whatever method that you choose. But I chose to teach a class how to do it using the Xbox method. And today we're going to learn about what would you do if you had 2 terms. So if you had 2 terms, then you have two options of formulas that you need to choose from. So before we go into the 2 terms, one of your classmates had a question about solving factoring using the Xbox method. So I'm going to do a quick video on that right now. All right, so using my Ghetto Fabulous whiteboard, let's talk about how do you factor this polynomial here. So first thing you want to do is you want to count how many terms there are so you could know which direction to go with that factor man that I showed you guys earlier. So remember, term is separated by adding subtraction signs. So here's 1 term, 2 term, and 3 terms. So this is 3 terms. And when it's 3 terms, we call this a trinomial because the root word is tri, which means 3, trinomial. And if you looked at that factor man that I showed you earlier, if it's a trinomial, you want to make sure that you use the Xbox method. So we want to use the Xbox method with trinomials. But before we do that, we always want to make sure to see if there's a GCF. So here, 7y squared, 13, and 6, I asked myself, does 7, 13, and 6, is there anything that's divisible by 7, 13, and 6? And the answer is no. Nothing's divisible by that. There's y squared, y, and there's no y here. So there's no greatest common factor. These 3 terms don't have anything in common that can be divided by it. So we leave it as that. So I'm done finding the GCF, which there's none. So now I'm going to go down to doing the Xbox method. So again, just reminding you guys that the Xbox method is just one method to factor a trinomial. There's many methods. On Alex, will teach you a certain way. Maybe another teacher will teach you a certain way. Maybe online they might teach you a certain way. But the Xbox method is my favorite way of doing it because it works for the easy problems, the hard problems, the multivariable problems. It works for all of the problems. So I'm just going to stick to teaching one method and try it out. And if you don't like it and you like the other way that you learned it from another teacher or whatnot, feel free to do whatever works for you. But check this out and see if you like it this way. The first thing I do is I make sure that it's written in standard form. So written in standard form means that it's written from the highest exponent to lowest. So it's written in order from the highest exponent to lowest. So here is y squared, y, and then there's no exponent. So this is indeed in standard form, so I don't have to do anything about it. For those of you guys that are working on Alex, the nice thing about Alex is it's always written in standard form. When they give you the problem, they'll always have it in standard form, so you actually won't have to change anything about it. But just in case you get another textbook or another teacher that mixes up the order, then you want to make sure you write it in the correct order first. The second step is you are going to look, those are eyeballs, look at the first and third term. And you're going to write down, right two terms, or let me say, write two things, like I'll just write things, two things that multiply to give you the first and third terms. So that sounds more confusing than what it is. So I'm going to look at the first term and the last term, and I'm going to ask myself, hey, what two things multiply to give me 7y squared? Well, what two things multiply to give me 7y squared would be 7y and y, right? That's the only option. Now, what two things multiply to give me 6? Well, there's lots of things that multiply to give me 6. There's 1 and 6. There's 6 and 1. There's 2 and 3, and 3 and 2. Right, so there's a couple options. So let me just try one of the options. So let me try something that I know. Let's try 1 and 6. Okay, so 1 times 6 will give me 6. And I also know in mind there's other options. So if this doesn't work, I'm going to try the other options. All right, then the next step after I do that is I am going to cross multiply. So in other words, this is where the word x comes from. The word x box for this method. So I'm going to cross multiply. So when I cross multiply, I'm going to get 7y times 6, which will give me 42y, and then y times 1, which will give me y. And I'm going to ask myself, when I cross multiply, does this add or subtract to give me the second term? So that's what you want to be thinking in your head. So you might be wondering, what is this guy good for? What's this middle term good for? Well, this negative 13y is really important because it's going to tell you whether you chose the right numbers or not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at these two. When I cross multiply, I got 42y and y. So can I add or subtract these numbers to give me a negative 13y? Well, if I add, I get 43y. If I subtract, I get 41y. So the answer is nope, no. So those numbers do not work. So I should have gotten an eraser somewhere. Okay, here's some. Sorry. Again, excuse the ghetto fabulous video. So these numbers do not work, so I'm going to erase it. So 1 and 6 does not work. So I'm going to try something else. How about if I switch the order? What if I try 6 and 1, right? And again, if that doesn't work, then I'll try 2 and 3, because 2 times 3 is 6. But anyways, I'm going to try 6 and 1. So when I try 6 and 1, when I cross multiply, I get 7y and 6y. And I'm going to ask myself, is there any way that I can combine these to get a negative 13y? Can I add or subtract these numbers to get a negative 13y? And guess what? What do you think? All right, no response. So here, I'm going to do a negative and a negative. If I have a negative 7y and a negative 6y, I will indeed, if I add those two together, I get a negative 13y, which is what I wanted. So I know that these are the winner chicken dinner answers. So these are the right answers. But however, I need a negative here and a negative here. So how do you make these negative? Well, to make a negative 7y, you need 7y times a negative 1 will give me a negative 7y. And y times 6, I want it to be a negative 6y, so I'm going to put a negative 6. But I need to be really careful at this point because I really need to make sure that when I put these negatives, I need to make sure that if I multiply these two numbers, will I still get the number, the third term? And the answer is yes, thankfully. Negative 6 times a negative 1 does give me a positive 6. So that does work. So those are my winner chicken dinner numbers. So that's the part for x. Now the last part is the box. So what is box? So the box is when you box up your answer. So you box this up horizontally. So I draw those two boxes. So the problem 7y squared minus 13y plus 6, when I factor it, so factoring means writing it as a product of two or more polynomials. So when you write it as a product of two more things, the first thing that goes in the first box is this right here. The first box, the first horizontal box, 7y minus 6. And then the thing that goes in the second parentheses is the box below, which is y minus 1. So boxing it helps you to remember that you're writing your answers horizontally, like that. So this is the answer when you factor. And the very last step, which I encourage you to do, especially if you're doing a test or a quiz, is to make sure to check your answer. And how do you check your answer? Well, you check your answer simply by multiplying through. So remember, factoring is reverse of distribution. So if you want to check your answer, you just distribute. So distribute your answer. Sorry, I should have turned off my phone there. If I distribute my answer, meaning FOIL it, I'm going to get 7y squared minus 7y minus 6y plus 6. In other words, 7y squared, I combine my terms, which are these two, negative 13y plus 6. And holy smokers, that is exactly the same thing as that. So this indeed is the correct answer for factoring.